July 1883. The sun scorched the wooden streets of Abilene, Kansas. Dust rose in choking waves as heavy wagons rattled past, the iron rims scraping dry earth like a slow, jagged cut through the sweltering noon. Malachi Boone stood at the depot, the brim of his hat shadowing half his weathered face, one hand brushing sweat from his brow. He was not a man easily startled. He had faced blizzards that swallowed men whole, watched gamblers drop dead over a single wrong glance, and lived through endless summers when the prairie grass burned to ash. Yet none of that had prepared him for this moment. The train whistle screamed, sharp and long, before the engine ground to a halt, steam hissing white across the crowd. Men shouldered sacks of flour, women pulled children close, and the air was thick with sweat, rust, and worn leather. Malachi turned to leave. Just another train, no different from the hundreds before. And then he saw her. Evelyn Price stepped down as if the last 15 years had folded into nothing. Her hazel eyes, the same eyes that had once unraveled an 18-year-old boy's heart, still carried their quiet fire, though tempered now by hardship. Her dark hair, neatly braided, loosed a single strand against the frayed collar of a cream dress patched in more than one place. In her hand she clutched a small bag, as if it were all that remained of her life. Malachi froze. The memory hit hard. A summer afternoon in Tennessee, the creek cold against their feet. Evelyn, 15 years old, trembling but sure when she pressed her lips to his. The very next day, her family had gone. He had thought time would dull that moment. It hadn't. Seeing her now, it returned in sharp, merciless color. His voice cracked when he spoke her name. Evelyn. She halted mid-stride, her face flickering from surprise to shock to something deeper, like an old memory clawing its way back. Her lips parted, barely a whisper. Malachi. He moved toward her, boots crunching on gravel, heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer in his chest. He had never expected to see her again. Certainly not here. Not like this. What brings you here? His voice stumbled under the weight of all he left unsaid. Evelyn swallowed, lowered her eyes, then lifted them with quiet resolve. I came to meet my husband. The words sliced through him, blunt but cruel. Husband? Her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag until her knuckles whitened. She nodded, voice rough. I answered an ad. He's a farmer, a widower. He has a little girl. He needs a wife to keep the house. Malachi said nothing. A freight wagon thundered by, rattling the ground beneath him, but he felt only the hollow ache expanding in his chest. The girl who had once been his entire world now stood before him as a mail-order bride, sold into marriage by necessity. Evelyn's eyes wavered, carrying both defiance and a plea not to be judged. My father died last year. The bank took the house. I had nowhere else to go. This was the only road left. Malachi's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she deserved more, wanted to shout that she should not bury herself in some cold bargain. But he clenched his fists and kept silent. Then a voice rang out. Evelyn Price! They both turned. Across the depot stood a thin man, face drawn by sun and labor, sweat staining his brown vest. Beside him waited a rickety wagon. From inside, a little girl peeked out, 6 years old, wide dark eyes searching the crowd. Evelyn's shoulders stiffened. She drew a breath and stepped toward them, her every stride heavy as stone. Malachi stood rooted. The image of her by the creek, the nervous squeeze of her hand, the sparkle in her eyes, clashed against the sight of her now walking toward another man, another life. The midday heat seemed to split apart. Inside him, an old fire roared back to life, scorching away the calm he had carried for years. The wagon groaned forward, wheels shrieking against the dust-choked road. Evelyn sat beside the farmer, arms wrapped protectively around the girl, Hazel. The child glanced about and by chance met Malachi's gaze. For a fleeting instant, he thought he saw something there, a spark breaking through the shadows. Then the wagon rolled on, fading into the blur of heat and dust, leaving him alone on the depot platform, his heart torn between the past and the cruel weight of the present. That night, Malachi sat on the porch of his bunkhouse. His fingers twisted a stalk of dry grass as his eyes whined to search the starlit sky. Crickets hummed, horses shifted in the dark, but in his mind there was only Evelyn's gaze, heavy with sorrow, and the small girl clinging to her side. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, only that the fire rekindled in him would not be put out so easily. The cabin at the end of the dirt road was no home, only a shadow of one. Evelyn followed Walter and Hazel inside, and before she could grow used to the damp smell in the kitchen or the groan of the door against the wind, Walter was gone. He left with a short mutter about business in town, though Evelyn knew better. The scent of whiskey clung to his vest, and his dull eyes had nothing to do with work. 3 days passed, then 4. The cabin was left to Evelyn, a 6-year-old girl, and silence that settled like a heavy cloak. Hazel spoke little, no more than clipped replies. She still called Evelyn ma'am, hiding in corners with a battered doll clasped tight. Evelyn kept busy, scrubbing, cooking, washing. Her hands burned raw against the floorboards, but she bore it. She had chosen this road to survive. Still, at night, with the wind screaming through the cracks, her heart ached as if she had buried herself beneath this rotting roof. On the 5th day, as Evelyn bent at the well, hauling up a bucket heavy with water, the steady beat of hooves reached her. She looked up and saw Malachi Boone. He sat tall in the saddle, lean frame cutting long shadows in the sun. The brim of his hat shaded his face, but not his eyes. Evelyn froze. Her heart raced, yet she tightened her grip on the rope, willing herself steady. She was another man's wife now. Cold though that marriage might be, she had no right to falter. Malachi swung down, gave a small nod, his voice low and steady. "The henhouse is ready to give in. I can help you set it right." Heat rose to her face. She shook her head too quickly. No, I can manage." He studied her a moment, said nothing more. With a tilt of his hat, he led his horse on. Evelyn watched him go, relief and disappointment tangled in her chest. The next day, and the day after, come late afternoon, Malachi passed by again. He never stopped, only cast a glance at the cabin, as though asking without words if all was well. Evelyn pretended not to notice, but each time the hoofbeats faded, her chest hollowed as if something had slipped from her grasp. Hazel noticed too. Once she whispered, "Who is that man?" Evelyn faltered, then said softly, "An old acquaintance." One morning, Evelyn found the henhouse roof had collapsed. Broken planks scattered, the wind howled through gaps, chickens scattering in panic. She tried to brace the beams, but the weight forced her down, a jagged board tearing her sleeve, nearly slashing her wrist. Hazel cried out, running to her side, eyes wide with fear. Evelyn sank to the dirt, trembling, sweat and dust clinging to her skin. Hoofbeats came again. Malachi stood at the fence, gaze sharp. In a breath, he was off his horse and striding over. Evelyn opened her mouth to object, to keep her distance, but the ruin around her stole the words away. Malachi said nothing. He rolled up his sleeves and set to work. His strikes were sure, his movements clean, each nail driven with force and precision. Evelyn tried to help, but whenever her hand reached for a board, his calloused palm pressed firmer, steadying it. Once their fingers brushed, brief, fleeting, but it sent a flush through her, enough to make her draw back. He did not speak, only met her eyes with a calm, unwavering steadiness that rattled her heart more than any storm. Hazel perched on the step, doll in her lap, watching. When a hen darted past, Malachi gave a quick whistle, swooped down, and scooped it up with ease. He handed it gently to Hazel. She hesitated, then took it, a small smile flickering across her lips. Evelyn saw it and felt something inside her loosen. It was the first smile she had seen from Hazel since leaving the depot. When the work was done, Malachi wiped his hands and offered Evelyn a clean scrap of cloth. She hesitated, then took it, her voice catching. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I—" The words broke. He only gave a quiet nod. He turned back to his horse. Then Hazel spoke, soft but clear. "Goodbye, sir." Malachi paused. He looked at the child, his expression easing into a smile. Evelyn felt her chest twist at the sight. Hazel was beginning to see him as a light in the dark, and she herself, though she fought it, could not deny the strange safety his presence brought. That night, the cabin sat silent. Walter had yet to return. Evelyn stayed by Hazel's bed, brushing a hand over the child's hair until she slept. The steady rhythm of her breathing filled the room with a fragile peace. But when Evelyn sat alone at the window, staring over the empty fields, her mind returned again and again to Malachi Boone. His scarred hands, his quiet eyes, and the unspoken question that haunted her. Did her life still hold another path, beyond the long shadow of this weary cabin? That night, when darkness wrapped the cabin, Walter returned. His staggering steps and the reek of whiskey reached the door before he did. Hazel, huddled beneath her blanket with her doll pressed tight, flinched at the rough shout that cracked across the porch. Evelyn rushed out just in time to see Walter stumble hard against the frame, his face flushed, his eyes bloodshot. He barked words too slurred to make sense, then slammed a hand down on the table, rattling the lamp so violently it nearly went out. Hazel broke into sobs, small and sharp, piercing Evelyn's chest like a blade. She scooped the girl close, whispering soft reassurances, patting her back. Walter glanced their way, sneered, then staggered further inside before collapsing in a heap on the floor. Breath ragged, the stench of liquor spilling over everything. Evelyn could do nothing but drag a worn quilt over him and carry Hazel into the small back room, soothing her with quiet murmurs until her tears eased into hiccuping dreams. Long after, Evelyn sat stiff by the bed, eyes wide in the dark, her helplessness a weight pressing her lungs. Outside, under a wash of pale moonlight, another figure had been watching. From the saddle, Malachi had seen Walter's drunken fall, heard the child's faint cries carry through the cracks. His hand gripped the reins, jaw tight. Every instinct told him to go inside, but he stayed. Evelyn still bore the name of another man's wife. With a final look, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving only the stamp of hooves in the dirt. By morning, Walter rose groggy, gulped down a tin of water, and without a word to either Evelyn or Hazel, snatched his hat and muttered something foul before heading toward town again. Evelyn didn't follow, didn't plead. She only bent down, trembling as she gathered the broken stem of his pipe from the floor. That evening, as sunlight turned the prairie gold, the sound of hooves came steady and familiar. Malachi appeared at the sagging gate, reins in one hand, a small sack in the other. Hazel peeked from behind Evelyn's skirt, wide-eyed with curiosity. Malachi crouched low, his voice gentle as a breeze. "Got something for you." He unwrapped a few hard candies in wax paper, rare treasures for a country child. Hazel hesitated, glancing at Evelyn. Evelyn gave a nod and a small smile. The girl reached out shyly, and for the first time since Evelyn had come here, Hazel's lips curved in a true smile. Warmth welled in Evelyn's chest, sweet and aching all at once. Malachi sat on the porch step. Evelyn lingered, then lowered herself beside him. The evening wind carried the smell of cut hay. Hazel, a little distance off, scratched circles into the dirt with a stick, lifting her head now and then, eyes bright with a quiet joy. Malachi tilted his head toward Evelyn, voice low. "Last night, I passed by. Things didn't seem right." Her hands twisted together in her lap, eyes cast aside. "He's like that, often. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be." A short, bitter laugh slipped from her lips. "What choice do I have? My father's gone. The bank took the house. I had nothing left but to answer an ad. At least here there's a roof and a meal on the table." Her words faltered. She looked up and her gaze caught his. In that silence, memory returned sharp as a blade. 15 years ago, by a Tennessee creek, when an awkward kiss bound two young hearts. Now in the fading light, their eyes met again, heavy with what was never spoken. Evelyn's pulse raced. She turned away quickly, reminding herself she bore Walter's name, no matter how hollow. She could not allow herself to falter. Malachi pressed his lips tight. Whatever words rose inside him swallowed down before they reached his tongue. A stray breeze swept across, loosening strands of hair over her cheek. Her hand lifted to tuck them back, fingers trembling. Hazel looked up just then, catching the silence between them. She smiled faintly, as children often do when they sense truths adults cannot say aloud. Then she bent back to her circles in the dirt, guarding a secret she did not yet fully understand. The sky burned crimson with dusk. Malachi rose, dusting his palms. Evelyn stood as well, but said nothing more. He pulled on his hat, gathered the reins. This time, before mounting, he looked at Hazel. "Keep those candies safe. Don't eat them all at once." Hazel nodded solemnly, clutching the bundle, eyes bright. Evelyn watched the exchange, her heart caught between comfort and fear, for Malachi was reaching not only for her heart, but quietly for Hazel's as well. When his horse's hoofbeats faded into distance, Evelyn sank onto the porch again, staring at the earth where Hazel drew her circles. She told herself she must be strong, must hold the line. Yet Malachi's gaze lingered in her memory, sharp and tender like a scar freshly touched. And Hazel's smile, the first she'd shown to any man, made Evelyn wonder if life still held another doorway, though she had not yet dared to cross it. The days when Walter was gone, the cabin breathed easier. Evelyn cleaned. Hazel followed quietly at her side, growing used to the rhythm of a woman's hand steadying the kitchen. Yet the truest comfort came from a familiar figure that appeared now and again at the leaning fence, Malachi Boone. He never knocked, never intruded, only found reasons to be passing by, carrying a sack of nails, a hammer, or a length of spare timber. One afternoon he came with a bundle of old boards, saying the fence ought to be fixed before the winds turned rough. Hazel spotted him, and her face lit bright. She dropped her wooden doll and trailed close behind him, chattering questions about the horse, about the birds singing in the cottonwoods. Malachi answered each with patience, his low voice steady and warm. From the kitchen doorway, Evelyn found herself smiling. It had been a long time since Hazel's words tumbled out with such ease. Malachi drove posts into the earth, his calloused hands sure and strong. Evelyn hauled a bucket from the well, her shoulders shaking under the weight. The water sloshed, spilling over as she staggered. Malachi stepped forward, steadying her hand. His rough palm closed over her chilled fingers, and when she looked up, their eyes met. For an instant, the world narrowed to that quiet exchange. She pulled back quickly, voice unsteady. "Thank you. I can manage." He only nodded, turning back to his work. Yet his gaze lingered, and Evelyn knew that moment had unsettled her heart. By sundown, the fence stood firm again. Hazel laughed, showing Malachi the little flower crown she had woven from weeds. Evelyn watched, warmth stirring within her despite herself. But the peace shattered at the sound of hooves pounding heavy against the road. Walter appeared slouched in the saddle, eyes red, whiskey on his breath long before he dismounted. He stumbled down, sneering when he saw Malachi setting aside the hammer. "Well now, the good-hearted cowboy. Come to share supper, have you?" Evelyn dropped her gaze, fingers twisting in her apron. Malachi rose straight, saying nothing. Words meant nothing to a drunk. He tipped his hat lightly and turned to leave. Hazel darted after him, clutching at his sleeve, whispering quick as though afraid her father would hear. "You'll come back, won't you?" Malachi crouched, brushed a hand over her hair. His face was solemn but gentle. He gave a single nod, then mounted up, iron hooves fading into the dusty light. Evelyn's chest ached as she watched him go, fear and longing pulling tight together. Inside, the cabin door shut hard. Walter stood still for a breath, the sour smell of liquor thick around him. Then, sudden as lightning, his hand struck. The slap cracked like thunder in the small room. Evelyn reeled, falling to the floor, her cheek seared hot. "You filthy woman!" Walter's voice rasped, guttural. "You bring another man into my house?" Hazel screamed, flinging her doll aside and rushing to Evelyn, clutching her tight. Her tear-filled voice broke against the walls. "Don't hurt her, please! He only gave me candy!" But a child's plea could not pierce Walter's hardened heart. His eyes fell on the small packet Malachi had left on the table. With a snarl, he snatched it up and hurled it to the ground. Candies scattered across the floorboards, red and white pieces spinning under the lamp's dim glow like drops of blood. Hazel collapsed to her knees, sobbing as she gathered them, trembling hands closing around each piece. Evelyn pulled her close, tears spilling unchecked. Walter heaved ragged breaths, swaying before dropping into a chair, too spent for further rage. Evelyn stayed on the floor, Hazel locked in her arms, her eyes burning as she stared at the scattered sweets. She felt it then. The fracture was no longer a hairline crack. It had torn wide, a raw break across the life she had forced herself to endure. Hazel looked up, her lashes wet, whispering into Evelyn's shoulder. "Ma, he'll come back, won't he?" Evelyn had no answer. She only held her tighter, eyes fixed on the black window where Malachi had vanished into the night. Something within her had splintered, but with it rose something else, fragile, but stronger than fear. It stirred like a hidden flame, waiting for breath enough to burn. That night, Abilene was louder than usual. In the saloon, Walter picked a fight with a card player. A bottle shattered, curses spilled into the street. Malachi happened to be nearby, lingering outside just long enough to hear, to see. He knew exactly what it meant. When Walter drank deep, the ones who paid the price weren't men at the table. It was the woman in the cabin and the little girl under its roof. Malachi turned his horse from town, urging it through the dark. The night was thick, the fields cloaked in silence but for the rasp of crickets and the pale smear of moonlight across the prairie. The cottonwoods whispered as he rode the familiar track to the cabin. The lamp still burned in the kitchen window. He knocked once, quiet. After a pause, the door creaked open. Evelyn stood there in the dim glow, eyes shadowed, cheek swollen red. The lantern in her hand trembled, casting thin lines of light over the breaks in her spirit. Malachi did not ask. He saw enough. He stepped inside when she gave a faint nod. The cabin was still. Hazel slept in the back room, her steady breathing the only fragile thread holding Evelyn upright. They sat at the wooden table. The hearth was cold, ashes scattered, night air slipping through the cracks in the walls. Evelyn clutched the lamp between them, as though the flame was the only thing keeping her from being swallowed whole by the dark. It was a long while before she spoke, her voice raw. "I don't know where else to go, Malachi." His hands lay heavy on the table, his voice low and certain. "You don't have to stay. I'll take you and Hazel, tonight. Now, if you'll come." Evelyn lifted her eyes, wet and glimmering. In that instant she saw it clearly. The wide road stretched before her, the open sky waiting, freedom close enough to reach, and beside her, the only man who had ever made her heart tremble. The boy who had been her first love, the man who might well be her last. Tears welled, catching the lamplight. Malachi reached across the table, his palm rough and warm against her bruised cheek. It was not the touch of possession, but of shelter. Evelyn closed her eyes, a tear slipping free, her whole body quivering under the weight of that gentleness. Then, sudden as a snap, she drew back. Her breath came fast, broken. She rose quickly, retreating toward the window, turning her face away so he would not see it wet with tears. "Don't come back, Malachi." Her voice cracked, but her words stood firm. "If you keep coming, I'll want you to stay, and that will only bring ruin." Silence pressed the room. Malachi remained still, his gaze dark but free of judgment. He understood her fear, the fear of Walter, the fear of gossip, the fear of her own heart. Evelyn's shoulders trembled, her hands clenched tight, as if sheer will could hold her life together. At last, Malachi rose. He said nothing more, only set a clean cloth on the table where her fingers bore dried blood. Then he drew on his hat, opened the door, and stepped out. The night air rushed in, and the lamp flame wavered. Evelyn turned, just in time to see his figure vanish into the dark. Hoofbeats drifted into the distance, fading into the chorus of insects, leaving the cabin hollow behind him. She stood frozen a long moment. Then, from the back room, Hazel stirred, murmuring a soft "Mama" in her sleep. Evelyn wiped her cheeks and went to the child's side, folding her close. In the dim light, she knew she had just turned away, the one hand strong enough to carry her out. Yet deep inside, her heart still pounded with the heat Malachi had left behind, a warmth she knew she could never let herself forget. The storm rose before dusk. The silver sky fell heavy, the wind howled across the prairie, rattling every loose shutter. Evelyn fought to fasten the latch, pulling Hazel close to the hearth. The cabin shook with each gust, rain lashing the tin roof in a ceaseless roar, as if the world meant to come down in one great crash. Hazel clung to her mother, eyes wide, brimming with tears. Evelyn wrapped her tight, whispering comfort, until the child's sobs slowed and sleep claimed her within the cocoon of blankets. Her soft breathing dulled the storm's edge. Evelyn leaned back against the wall, body weary, spirit hollow. Walter had been gone 3 days. She did not expect him, nor did she want him. Only the cold emptiness pressed close. Outside, Malachi pressed on through the gale. He could not bear the thought of Evelyn and Hazel alone in that frail cabin. He had sworn to stay away, but his heart refused to obey. By the time his horse reached the porch, he was drenched, rain streaming from his coat, hair plastered against his brow. The pounding on the door startled her. Evelyn lit another lamp and opened it. The glow spilled across Malachi's face, shadowed and soaked. Water pooled at his boots, dripping from every edge of him. "In a storm like this, I had to know you two were safe," he said, voice low, trembling with the cold. Her hand gripped the doorframe, heart thundering. She had told him not to come back, yet every night she had prayed to hear hoofbeats stop outside. And now, he was here. A shiver ran through her, not from the wind, but from the truth of it. "Come in," she whispered, stepping aside. He entered, shutting out the storm, his breath ragged. She thrust a worn towel into his hands. He wiped at the rain, yet his eyes never left her. The bruise on her cheek had faded, but in his gaze it burned clearer than ever. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "But I wanted you here. Every day." The words slipped free, heavy in the air. Malachi stood still, eyes dark with depth. He set his hat aside, his wet hands shaking faintly. "Evelyn," his voice roughened, "since the day you left, I've never loved another. The prairie is wide, but nothing has ever filled that hollow. I've lived only to keep moving, trying to forget. Yet each night I remembered. I thought, if the day ever came that you needed me, I would be there, to shield you, even if it was from a distance." Her fingers dug into the table edge. Her eyes blurred, unable to hold his, her whole body shuddering as the words unearthed what she had buried for so long. Slowly, Malachi stepped closer, lifting her face in his rough palm. The lamplight cast their shadows together against the wooden wall. "I won't let you spend another night like this," he said, steady and sure. "You and Hazel deserve safety. If you'll allow it, I'll carry the rest for you." She closed her eyes, leaning into his hand, hot tears falling. Her voice wavered, frail but true. "You were my first kiss, when I was 15, and I want you to be my last." The storm outside seemed to hush. The moon glimmered faint through the window. Their breath mingled, and when Malachi lowered his lips to hers, it was slow, tender, as though 18 years had led only to this moment. Evelyn trembled, her arms circling him, and for the first time in years, Her heart beat alive. That night, while Hazel slept undisturbed, Evelyn and Malachi sat together on the old rug before the hearth. The faint firelight flickered across their faces, marking tears and the fragile curve of new smiles. Words were few. They gave instead trust, the long stifled ache of longing, and a comfort neither had known. Evelyn shook, but not with fear. Malachi's embrace steadied her, his breath warm, his touch gentle enough to erase every scar. In the storm, the cabin ceased to be a place of cold. For the first time, Evelyn felt she belonged wholly to someone's arms. Outside, rain crashed, the wind moaned wild, but inside they had each other. And in that silence a new beginning was written, not with papers and vows, but with hearts rediscovered after years of loss. When dawn came pale across the prairie, the storm had passed. Evelyn lay with her head against Malachi's chest, listening to his steady heart. A smile traced her lips through the dried salt of tears. She whispered like a prayer, "From now on, I am not afraid." The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered in the cabin like a crack that could never be mended. Evelyn sat quietly by the bed, watching Hazel sleep, the child's small hands locked tight around the frayed doll she carried everywhere. Outside, Malachi's figure moved slowly along the porch, restless, unable to close his eyes. Both of them knew the morning ahead would not be like any other. Evelyn rose and opened the small wooden chest. Inside lay nothing but a few worn dresses, her mother's faded shawl, and a Bible whose spine was nearly split. She folded each piece with trembling hands, binding them with a strip of cloth. Every item, every knot tied, was a cut severing her from the place that had held her captive in fear. When Hazel stirred, eyelids fluttering open, Evelyn bent close and whispered, "We're leaving, my girl." The child rubbed her eyes, then glanced toward the door where Malachi had just stepped in. The lantern in his hand stretched long shadows across the wall. He did not question, did not speak. His firm nod was enough. In his eyes, Evelyn saw the steadiness she had lacked for so long. Before stepping out, she sat at the table, pulled a scrap of paper and a dull pencil, and began to write. No words of anger, no pleas, only a single final truth. She was taking Hazel so the child could grow in safety, that Malachi would guard them, and that Walter no longer had the right to undo it. The note was short, but each stroke weighed heavy as iron. She folded it neatly, left it where Walter would surely see. Hazel pushed herself upright, still groggy. Evelyn cupped her face, her voice soft but breaking. "My love, I must ask you this. If you wish to stay with your father, I'll bring you back to him. But if you want to come with me, I promise, I'll never leave you behind." For a long moment, Hazel was silent. Then her face crumpled, and she threw herself into Evelyn's arms, sobbing. "I only want to be with you, Mama. Don't ever leave me." The words tore through Evelyn's chest. She held her daughter close, pressing trembling lips to the crown of her hair, tears dampening the child's shoulder. Malachi watched in silence, and in his heart rose a vow so deep it needed no voice. He stepped forward and lifted Hazel gently. She nestled against him, doll clutched tight, her small arms winding around his neck. In Malachi's hold, the child no longer trembled. Evelyn reached for his hand, and together they stepped out onto the porch. The horse was ready. Malachi set Hazel on the saddle before him, then reached down to steady Evelyn as she climbed up behind. She wrapped her arms around Hazel, and when Malachi swung into place, the three of them breathed as one. Not once did they look back. The cabin shrank into the night, swallowed by shadow, a chapter closed without farewell. The dawn wind carried the damp scent of last night's storm. Across the field, moonlight spread pale and thin. The steady beat of hooves struck the softened earth, each strike echoing like the pulse of a new beginning. Evelyn rested her head against Malachi's shoulder, warmth seeping into her bones until she no longer felt alone. Her hair brushed his neck, but neither spoke. In the hush, silence itself seemed stronger than words. Hazel soon drifted off, her breathing steady, her arms still wrapped around her doll. Peace softened her face, a calm she had never known at night. No fear of doors slamming open, no dread of a drunken voice. Evelyn watched her, smoothing a hand over her hair, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. The road ahead stretched long, uncertain. Hardship lay waiting, no doubt. Yet under the pale moon and the rhythm of hooves in the dark, none of that mattered. All that mattered was this: they had chosen each other, and this time they would not let go. The road to Malachi's ranch stretched wide across the open grassland. Dawn wind slipped low, brushing dew from the tall blades of prairie grass. After a long night's ride, as the sun crested the horizon, a cabin came into view on a rise of earth. It was not new, not polished, but its frame stood solid, the porch spread wide, and cottonwoods lined behind it like watchful sentinels. Hazel rubbed her eyes, clutching her worn doll tight. Her voice came small, uncertain. "This is home." Evelyn did not answer at once. She slid down from the saddle, stepping onto the porch. Her hand touched the rough wood of the post, tracing cracks in the steps. The air smelled of dust and stillness, yet there was no reek of whiskey, no echo of slurred rage. Only quiet, waiting. Malachi led the horse into the yard, his voice steady, warm. "If you'll allow it, then yes, this will be home." Evelyn turned, tears glinting, though a faint smile curved her lips. She nodded. The first day unfolded with the awkward rhythm of beginnings, yet there was warmth in it. Malachi opened the shutters, letting light stream through, sweeping down cobwebs from the beams. Evelyn carried out old blankets, shook them clean, lit a fire in the narrow hearth. The first flames caught with a resinous scent, and Hazel clapped her hands in delight, as though she'd witnessed magic. By noon, they stepped out to clear the land behind the house. Malachi rolled his sleeves, set posts into the soil, muscles taut as he drove each stake with sure force. Evelyn hauled water from the well, her cheeks flushed in the sun. Hazel busied herself collecting stones in a basket, darting about with bare feet muddied, laughter trailing bright behind her. Evelyn thought, watching, "She looks as though she's finally found where she belongs." When the fence stood firm, Malachi called Hazel over. "Come here, little one. I've got something special for you." He led out his bay horse, tall and gleaming. Hazel's eyes widened, fear flickering, but Malachi knelt, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Don't be afraid. He's gentle. I'll hold tight." Hazel bit her lip, then nodded. He lifted her to the saddle, one big hand steady on the reins. The horse stepped slow and careful around the yard. Hazel's giggles rose like song, her face lit with wonder, as though she had never known such joy. From the porch, Evelyn shaded her eyes, her heart swelling. a lump thick in her throat. Malachi's patience, the way he spoke to Hazel, the tenderness in his gaze. It was nothing like Walter's cold, sharp ways. Evelyn realized then that what Hazel needed was not a father who shouted, but a man who could listen, who would wait for her smile to bloom. By evening, the cabin no longer felt empty. The hearth glowed, the table was cleared, and in the corner Hazel sat bent over a small wooden horse Malachi had carved for her. Evelyn stitched at a torn dress, while Malachi repaired his worn boots. Words were few, yet peace filled the room. Outside, the sky deepened to amber. Evelyn lifted her eyes and met Malachi's. A rush of warmth spread through her, and she looked quickly down, her needle trembling. Still, her heart echoed the truth. Here she was no longer adrift. Hazel suddenly ran over, holding the carved horse out. "Look, Mama, Malachi made it for me!" Evelyn drew her close, staring at the little figure in her hand. Simple, small, but heavy with care. She looked at Malachi once more. He only inclined his head, eyes calm and deep. No words passed, yet Evelyn understood. He had taken on this weight not from duty, but from love, for both mother and child. Night fell. They laid blankets near the fire. Hazel soon drifted to sleep, clutching the wooden horse. Evelyn lay on her side, listening to the soft crackle of kindling. Malachi sat in a chair, gaze turned outward into the dark. In the hush, Evelyn whispered, more to herself than to him, "It's been so long since I felt safe." Malachi did not turn, only answered low, "Then let it last." Evelyn closed her eyes, holding in a sigh. Somewhere deep within, a door cracked open, a place where trust could grow, where hope returned, and where love, thought lost, waited patiently to rise again. In only a few days, the house that once held nothing but dust and silence was transformed. Hazel darted across the yard, her little feet splattered with mud, her laughter ringing bright against the wide sky. Evelyn watched, stunned and moved. This was the same child who once curled into corners, clutching a tattered doll, silent as stone. Now she flew like a bird set free, finding her sky at last. Malachi was endlessly patient. He showed Hazel how to feed the horse, how to gather kindling, even how to tell deer tracks from rabbit prints in the soft earth. Hazel listened wide-eyed, her dark gaze lit with wonder. One afternoon, when Malachi hoisted her onto his shoulders to pluck wild berries from a tree, Hazel threw her arms around his neck and cried out a word that made Evelyn's heart tremble. "Papa!" Malachi froze, his eyes flickering. He turned toward Evelyn, searching for her answer. She stood on the porch, one hand gripping her dress, tears burning. She gave the smallest nod. From that moment on, the name took root. What had been empty in Hazel's heart was filled with a love she had never known. Evelyn, too, was changing. At first, her face was taut, her smiles faint and strained. But now, whenever Hazel chirped happily beside Malachi, a true smile curved her lips without thought. Sometimes Malachi caught her watching him from a distance, her gaze no longer only thankful, but trusting. One evening, after supper had been cleared, and Hazel, weary from play, had fallen into early sleep, Evelyn went to the shed to fetch wood. In a dim corner, she found a wooden box covered in dust. Inside lay an old guitar, strings rusted, but the frame still firm. Her hand brushed its surface, and a memory surged, her father strumming in the twilight, while her mother sang low, filling their home with something brighter than firelight. Music had once been in her blood, but she had buried it with her grief. She carried it inside, wiping away the years. Malachi sat by the hearth, watching as she settled into a chair. Tentatively, she plucked at the strings. At first the notes were dull, but as she tightened and tuned, a simple melody began to flow. The cabin, once filled only with the sigh of wind and the crackle of wood, bloomed with trembling, aching sound. Evelyn sang softly. Her voice was not strong, but it was tender, honest, each word soaking into the room. Malachi sat still, staring not at the guitar, but at her hands on the strings, her face glowing in the firelight. His chest ached. For years he had wandered, dust his only companion, the road his only master. But here, now, he saw it plain. This was home. This was the family he could not lose again. When the song faded, Evelyn set the guitar aside, cheeks flushed. She grew shy under his gaze. "It's been so long since I touched one," she whispered. "I thought I'd forgotten." But somehow, the sound was still there. Malachi's voice was low, certain. Some things never vanish. They wait, buried, until someone brings them back. Just like you, Evelyn. The words struck deep, leaving her breathless. She dropped her eyes, fingers brushing the strings, as if to steady herself. She said nothing, but inside she knew he had touched the tenderest part of her soul. Later that night, with Hazel asleep in the corner, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. The stars burned bright over the prairie. Malachi joined her, silent at first. The night hummed with crickets and wind sweeping tall grass. Then he spoke. "I've lived too many years as a shadow, but since you came back, I know there is something worth holding to. I won't lose it again." She turned to him. His eyes held no grand promises, only a vow as steady as the man himself. For the first time in years, Evelyn smiled without bitterness. Inside, Hazel stirred in her sleep, murmuring, "Papa." Evelyn heard it, and felt both sweetness and ache in her chest. But when Malachi laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, she knew. The ache was mending. The wound was learning to heal. Winter came harsher than any before. Winds tore across the stripped prairie, sweeping snow in drifts that buried autumn's traces. The sky hung leaden, frost bit into skin, and each morning when Evelyn opened the door, her breath broke white in the air before vanishing into the gale. Yet inside the cabin, where the fire glowed steady, she and Hazel were no longer alone. Malachi stacked logs into the stove, each piece snapping with sparks. Hazel sat bundled in blankets, clutching the little wooden horse he had carved, her eyes shining as she listened to his stories, of sandstorms in Texas, of wild horses no rope could hold. Evelyn, seated across, stitched the hem of her daughter's dress, glancing up now and then at him. Firelight traced Malachi's face, his dark eyes steady, and for the first time in her life, she felt wholly safe. Outside, wind screamed and snow battered the walls. Inside, three souls huddled close, as though they had always belonged to one another. Hazel's eyelids drooped until she curled beside the hearth, drifting to sleep on the warmth of steady breath. Evelyn set aside her sewing, her gaze fixed on the flames. Memories welled up until words escaped before she could stop them. "Do you know why I left everything? Why I agreed to marry a man I had never met?" Malachi looked to her, waiting. She drew her knees close, her voice low, trembling. "Because I am a colored woman, Malachi." In Tennessee, it didn't matter that I studied, that my father fought tooth and nail for our land. To them, I was always less. Every door was shut. They mocked me, looked at me as if I had stepped into a world not meant for me. When my father died, when the bank took our house, I understood. I had no choice left. Tears welled, slipping as she stared into the fire. Walter didn't marry me for love. He needed someone to cook his meals and mind his child. I told myself, maybe that was fate, until you came back. Malachi drew a deep breath, his rough hands trembling faintly on his knees. He reached across the table, laying his palm gently over hers. The warmth startled her, but she did not pull away. Evelyn, his voice rumbled like earth before rain. I see all of it, and I choose still, not from pity, not from duty, but because I never forgot you. From that first kiss by the creek when we were 15, my heart has belonged nowhere else. Her breath caught. She had dreamed of such words once, but never believed she would hear them. Her shoulders shook as tears flowed, not of shame, but of a heart finally seen, finally chosen, no matter the color of her skin or the scars on her past. She lifted her gaze, eyes burning bright in the firelight. Malachi's hand closed gently around hers. His eyes locked on her, as though nothing beyond this moment existed. The storm shrieked against the walls, snow pounded the timbers, but here, the world narrowed to two. Evelyn leaned toward him. Malachi wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her into his chest. I'm here, he whispered into her hair. Nothing will drive me away again. On the rug by the hearth, Hazel stirred in her sleep. Her lips moved around a word soft with dreams. Papa. Evelyn heard it, and her heart broke open. She wept into Malachi's embrace, but for the first time in her life, the tears came from joy. He held her close, letting her sob against his shirt until the fabric grew damp, his arms tightening as though to shield her from the whole storming world. They sat that way, two souls bound, the child sleeping nearby, fire crackling, wind howling. No vows spoken, none needed. The choice was made already, in his arms around her, in her head against his chest, in the fragile new family born out of ruin. The harsh winter slowly loosened its grip, giving way to patches of brown earth beneath the thaw. The first green shoots pierced through the soil, small but certain, promising that something new was beginning. Evelyn stood on the porch, watching Hazel dart across the yard with her wooden horse clutched tight, laughter ringing through the morning air. A strange, quiet peace swelled inside her chest, one she had not thought possible. Life with Malachi had shifted everything. Gone were the nights filled with tension and drunken shouting. In their place came steady rhythms, Malachi leading the horses out each dawn, Hazel trailing behind to fetch kindling, and Evelyn at the stove, filling the kitchen with the scent of warm cornbread. Hazel's laughter now echoed through the wooden house, chasing away silence that had once seemed permanent. One morning, Evelyn dared something she never thought she would again. She decided to open a little school. She had carried her father's books from Tennessee, tucked away through each move, relics she refused to abandon. Now, at last, they had a use. An empty room in Malachi's home was swept clean. Rough-hewn benches were hammered together, a chalkboard painted from an old slab of wood. On the first day, only a handful of children appeared, farmers' sons and daughters, hesitant but curious. Hazel sat proudly in the front row, her eyes shining because her mama was the teacher. Evelyn's voice steadied as she traced letters across the board. The children repeated after her, their tones uneven, their faces alight with wonder. For the first time in years, she felt unbound from scorn or shadow. She was not a servant, not a cast-off. She was a woman planting seeds for the future, not only for Hazel, but for this small, forgotten town. That afternoon, Malachi lingered at the doorway. He did not interrupt, only leaned against the frame, watching Evelyn bend to guide a small hand across the chalk. A soft smile curved his mouth. In his eyes was the quiet conviction that, after years on the trail, he had finally found a home worth staying for. Hazel, too, had begun to bloom. She no longer shrank from every sound, no longer clutched her doll as if it were a shield. When Malachi returned late from the fields, she bolted to the gate, shouting, "Papa!" and wrapped her arms around his legs. She was no longer a child lost in shadows. She had found her family. Malachi built more than fences now. He began hammering together a small room beside the house. "For our princess," he said with a grin, and Hazel squealed with joy, smearing paint across her little hands as she insisted on helping. Evelyn watched, heart swelling at the simple scene. This was how families grew, not through grand gestures, but through the daily acts of love and labor. One golden evening, as the sun spread honey-colored light over the prairie, Evelyn felt a flutter inside her. She pressed a hand to her belly, breath catching. A new life was stirring. Joy and fear tangled together, leaving her trembling. When Malachi came in, still dusted with wood shavings, she stepped forward. She took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. His brow furrowed in question. Evelyn's voice trembled with emotion. "We'll be needing a cradle." For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy. Then Malachi pulled her into his arms, holding tight. His breath was rough, but his gaze brimmed with peace. He pressed his forehead to hers. "Evelyn, thank you. I swear you and the children will never know a day of fear again." Her laugh broke through tears as she buried her face in his chest. The girl who once believed herself unwanted, cast aside, now stood as wife, mother, and the heart of a home that was finally hers. From the doorway, Hazel peeked in with wide eyes. She rushed forward, hugging them both, and declared with pride, "I'm going to be a big sister." Evelyn knelt to embrace her, Malachi's arms encircling them all. 3 hearts beat together as one. Outside, tender shoots stretched toward the sky, whispering the promise of a spring filled with hope. Years rolled by across the plains of Kansas. Seasons turned, rains came and went. The sun scorched and softened. But one thing remained steady at Malachi and Evelyn's ranch: laughter. Hazel grew up in the warmth of their arms. She was no longer the frightened child who once curled in the corner of a cabin, clutching a worn doll. Now she was a young woman, her long hair tied back neatly, her eyes still curious and bright, but softened by the peace of a childhood finally restored. The ranch, once a bare wooden house, had flourished. Rows of corn stretched wide. Chickens clucked noisily in the yard, and the fields rippled under the afternoon wind. Children's laughter filled the air, not just Hazel's, but also that of her younger brother, born a few years later, a living bond of Malachi and Evelyn's love. They lived ordinary days, yet those days were full. Evelyn was no longer the silent, resigned woman she once was. She was wife, mother, and teacher. Her small schoolhouse, begun with nothing but old books from Tennessee, had become a familiar place for the children of the prairie. Each afternoon, boys and girls ran in from nearby farms. Evelyn stood before the board, her voice firm, her chalk steady. Hazel often helped grade papers, her pride clear in every smile. Malachi watched quietly from the doorway or from the fields. He spoke little, but his work spoke for him. Fences mended, boards replaced, the well cleaned and strengthened. The house stood solid because he held it that way, just as he held the hearts within it. Hazel blossomed in this steadiness. One summer afternoon, Evelyn sat sewing on the porch and heard Hazel teaching her brother an old rhyme. The sound of her daughter's laughter rose like morning light, bringing tears to Evelyn's eyes. Hazel had found what Evelyn once feared she could never give her: a safe, unbroken childhood. As the years ripened, small moments shone brightest. A summer evening when the three of them sat together on the porch, Malachi's arm draped gently around Evelyn's shoulders, Hazel leaning against her mother, and the boy tumbling in the grass at their feet. Cicadas hummed, wild grass swayed, and the horizon glowed gold. The picture was simple but whole. Evelyn turned to Malachi, her eyes glistening in the last light. His face was weathered now, lined with years of labor and love. Yet his strength remained, and in it she saw every mile they had walked together, from that dusty day at Abilene Station to this moment here. Never once had he let go of her hand. "You know," she whispered, voice carried by the breeze, "love doesn't need many words. It just needs us to choose each other, again and again." Malachi squeezed her shoulder gently. He said nothing, but the slow nod he gave was enough to still her heart. Hazel, watching, didn't grasp the weight of her mother's words, but she felt the peace in them. She reached out, linking her small hand in theirs. One fragile hand. But it bound the three of them together. Night fell. The oil lamp glowed golden across the table. Supper was simple: cornbread, vegetable stew, but the room rang with laughter. Hazel recounted something from her lessons. Her brother interrupted with eager, lisping words, and Malachi sat listening, a rare, soft smile breaking across his rugged face. Evelyn looked on, her heart overflowing with what she once thought impossible: a true home. Beyond their walls, the prairie stretched on, wild and endless. Storms would come, harvests would fail, winters would cut deep. Yet inside this wooden house, one thing would not change. They had chosen each other and would keep on choosing. Looking back on Malachi, Evelyn, and Hazel, we see a circle both closing and beginning again. From hardship and loneliness, they had found each other in a fragile moment. Through the act of choosing, to love, to hold, to become family, they had turned a barren field into a home filled with laughter. On that porch, beneath the evening sky, the truth was simple. Love did not need grand words. It was patience. It was a steady gaze. It was arms ready to hold after every storm. No matter our age, we still long to be chosen, to belong again and again. Dear friends, does this story remind you of a love from your past, or of a home once bright with laughter? Share your thoughts below. If this journey touched your heart, we invite you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Every word you share is cherished, from one heart that has weathered many seasons to another.